Hi, One God Ministries in here, and today we're going to talk about one of the misleading topics, which is the theory of evolution, a deception. Okay? In Romans chapter 1, verse 18, it is stated, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse." So, what this text written by the Apostle Paul is saying is that what can be known about God, particularly God's existence and confirmation that He really is there, can be seen from what has been created. That is, the evidence of the Creator is in His creation. Okay, so we can see that men are without excuse, especially if they say there is no God, simply because the existence of God can be proven by His creation. Okay, so to highlight what has been said, what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. God's eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So man cannot question whether God really exists or not. It's not really an excuse if man will simply look at creation and understand that it cannot come into being without a creator. Okay, so creation is so exact and perfect not to have a designer. This is the conclusion you will have. So let us look at creation. Just think about the symbiotic relationship of a bee and a flower, a butterfly and a flower, a clownfish and an anemone. Okay, so in here we have a bee and a flower. The bee and flowers have a complicated and beneficial symbiotic relationship. That is, both benefit from this relationship. In a symbiotic relationship between bees and flowers, both parties benefit from that relationship. And not only bees and flowers, everyone benefits from this relationship. The bees need the flowers for food, and flowers depend on the bees for pollination. Most bees live in large colonies, and these colonies consist of a queen bee, a female workers, and male bees. The queen has only one duty, and that is to lay eggs. And this means there are a lot of offsprings to feed. Okay? For them, the relationship between bees and flowers is of particular importance. The only food they eat is pollen, which is, along with honey, the only source of food. What the relationship is saying is that the bees cannot really exist with the pollen, or rather the nectar of the flowers, which the bees turn into honey. Okay? And in turn, the flowers benefit from the existence of bees who gather their pollen, because the bees actually pollinate the flowers. Okay? And for the flowers, pollination means they will produce fruits. They will be fertilized and produce fruits, which in turn will produce more plants that will produce more flowers. In other words, if there was no bee to gather the pollen and the honey of the flowers, and the nectar of the flowers, then there would be no one to pollinate actually the flowers. And they cannot reproduce, meaning both need each other. So this comes to a question, if evolution was true, they would have a big question: which came first? Did the bees came first and develop whatever mouth they have that would fit exactly into the type of flower they gather the nectar with? Okay? And what about the flowers? How would they have evolved into something that would produce the nectar that the bees would actually need? So, what we see in here actually is a relationship between the bees and the flower, in which one cannot exist without the other. So one may ask, if evolution was true, which came first, the bees or the flowers? Actually, common sense would tell you that they have to come at the same time for them to be able to propagate their species, because the flower cannot propagate and produce fruits, okay, not unless there was a bee, and the bees wouldn't have anything to eat other than the nectar which they gather from the flowers and the pollen, okay, which they in turn turn into honey. Okay, so we see that symbiotic relationships in nature are very complicated, and pinpoints that there was indeed a wise creator who created the bee so that they would gather their food from the flowers, and in turn they would pollinate the flowers. The same is true with a butterfly and certain species of flowers, in which the butterfly developed this proboscis, okay, which fits exactly into the flower so that it can gather the nectar. So the adult butterflies feast on the nectar provided by flowers, drawing it in through a long straw-like proboscis. They are drinking the flower's pollen clings to their feet and legs, being transferred to other flowers as they feed from flower to flower. In cooler climates, the flowers provide the butterfly with a warm place to rest, a feature that is particularly noticed in solar tracking flowers that turn their blooms toward the sun as it moves through the sky. So we see in here the wisdom of the Creator. He gave the butterfly a proboscis which fits exactly into the flower to gather the nectar, which is food for the butterflies. And in turn, the butterflies helps in the fertilization of the flower, okay, so that the flowers were turned into fruits which would have the seeds for the propagation of the plants. Okay, so we see in here a relationship wherein one could not exist without the other. And only a very intelligent creator could have put these things together. And what about the clownfish and the anemone? We see in here an anemone actually has toxins which is not really poisonous to the clownfish. In fact, the clownfish needs the anemone for protection. It lays its eggs near the anemone so that when the young of the clownfish develop, they would simply go to the anemone and seek protection. The anemone would protect the clownfish with their nematocysts, with their toxins, and they would sting other fishes that would try and attempt to harm the clownfish. In turn, there are certain fishes, such as butterfly fishes, which attack the anemones. Okay, and then the clownfish would then try and defend the anemone from such predatory butterfly fishes. Okay, so what we see in here is that one can also not exist without the other. That is why in areas where anemones are taken out, sooner or later, the clownfish population dwindles and even disappears because there would be no anemone to protect its young and also the clownfish itself. They would be easy prey for fishes such as grouper, which are actually stung by anemones. Okay, so we can see in here another example of the wisdom of the Lord, of the Creator, in creating animals with very, very complex symbiotic relationships. Okay? So in order to live among the anemone, the clownfish first and foremost protect themselves from nematocyst strikes. Okay? While most fish try to eat the nutrient-rich tentacles of the anemone, the possibility of being stung while eating deters the clownfish from nibbling on it. In return, the anemone does not strike the clownfish. Okay? On the off chance that the clownfish is struck, it is protected by a thick mucus layer. So we see in here a very, very intelligent design of the Creator. Okay? In Psalms 139, verse 14, it is stated, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. So we see in here that the psalmist said that he was beautifully and wonderfully made. So we see in here a human body with a different systems of the body, particularly the endocrine system. You can see in here our Creator giving us the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the pancreas, which we all need to live well. Okay, if any of this organ malfunctions, a lot of things can happen to you, and you might not even be able to survive a few minutes or more, okay? Imagine if you have an overactive thyroid, you would be hyperthyroid, and your metabolism would be so fast, and your heart would beat so fast, that you can practically wear your heart out. And if your thyroid, for example, is underactive, you would simply have a very slow metabolism, and your cholesterol levels would clog your arteries, and you would even have high blood sugar because of the low metabolism. And the same thing is true with the pancreas. If it is malfunctioning, there would be no insulin to handle the excess sugar. So you see in here, everything within our system, the organs in our system, even the ovary and the testicles of humans actually are perfectly made by God to work and coordinate with each other. It cannot have come by chance of us developing simply different organs by chance. Otherwise, it would be a disaster and only would produce a very unproductive, a very, what do you call this, malfunctioning organ, okay, that would only produce a body that is not working properly. Okay, let us take a look at some of the hormones. Let's say human growth hormone. If you don't have enough human growth hormone, what would happen to you? Your growth would be stunted, and even your cell reproduction would be stunted, and it could lead to your death. And about insulin in the pancreas, as we all know, we need that, for the control of our blood sugar. Otherwise, you would simply have a degenerate kidney if you have an overabundance of sugar in your blood. And then there are other things such as lipids and triglycerides, which has anabolic effect. Okay? And so if you study more and more deep into our organs, and into our hormones by itself, you can see the perfect design of the Creator. That is why the psalmist said he was beautifully and wonderfully made. Okay? And then in Psalms 14, verse 1, it is stated, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Their deeds are corrupt and vile. Not one of them does right." Yahweh or Jehovah looks down from heaven at the children of Adam to see if a single one is wise, a single one seeks God. All have turned away, all alike turned sour. Not one of them does right. So what David said in here is that only a fool will say there is no God, because the evidence that there is a God, that there is a Creator, can be seen in creation, can be seen in the perfect anatomy of a human, and even the anatomy of an animal, the anatomy of a flower, the symbiotic relationships between plants and animals. So there is no doubt that there really was a Creator, that is, there is a God, and only a fool will say there is no God. So to counter this proof of the Creator, the adversary, the devil, raised up one of his agents to mislead the world in the end times. And who did he raise up? None other than Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wrote in 1859 The Origin of Species. Hailed by scientists as a premier biologist and botanist, he was not a trained scientist, but was actually trained to be a theologian. Silly, isn't it? His free-thinking father, shrewdly realizing that the church was a better calling for an aimless naturalist, switched him to Christ's College in Cambridge in 1828. In a complete change of environment, Darwin was now educated as an Anglican gentleman. He took his horse, indulged his drinking, shooting, and beetle collecting passions with other squires' sons and managed 10th place in the Bachelor of Arts degree in 1831. So you see in here, the so-called premier biologist and botanist not really having an educational background in the sciences. Okay? Anyway, Charles Darwin viewed all beings, species, not as a special creation, but as lineal descendants of some few beings which lived long before. What he's saying is that Charles Darwin believed that the present plants and animals evolved in a series of misdirected evolution from simpler animals going into more complicated animals. And one of the evidences, he said, was the fossils, which are actually remains of ancient plants and animals or their impressions in rock. Here are examples of fossils. On the upper left, a fossil of an alligator, and then there are fossils of tooth and snails, even of starfish, and even of leaves. You know, some people might think these fossils are the actual remains of plants and animals. Is that correct? Actually, that is false. Okay? For fossils, for the most part, mean actually the remains of plants and animals that actually solidified into rock. They petrified. And how could that be? Some people do not understand. They think, for example, that this alligator skin was the original skin of the alligator, and these shells were the original shells. If you make a chemical analysis of these shells, for example, they are not the original calcium carbonate snails or shells of the animals. Also of this tooth. This is not the original tooth nor the skin of this alligator. They are actually impressions left on the surrounding sediments and later on was crystallized. You might wonder, how are fossils formed? How in the world did they become crystallized? Okay, plants and animals are buried in sediments. Sediments harden to form the mold. Plants and animals decompose and form the void. Deposition by water and minerals later crystallize. Okay, so I am going to explain what I just said by this example of how to form a fossil. Okay, this is actually an illustration more or less of how to form a fossil. So there is the original shell on the left, and then let's say the shell was buried, and in this case we were trying to make an impression using plaster. But in nature, shells would be buried in mud. Okay, and then additional mud would fall, or sediments would fall on top of this shell, which in this illustration is illustrated with petroleum jelly. Okay, so eventually what would form is actually an impression on the sediments. Okay, the sediments would eventually harden, and soon enough the shells themselves would dissolve, because the shells are made of calcium carbonate, which are actually somewhat soluble in water. So they would eventually decompose and turn to dust. The same happens with the bones of animals. Okay? So if you understood what I just showed you, a fossil is actually simply an impression on the sediments, and eventually the original part of the animal will decompose and form a void into the so-called sediments. And then water with their minerals would come and fill up those voids, and the chemicals would crystallize. For example, some shells would form impressions, would be filled up with water, with silica. Okay, and eventually silica crystals will form on this shell impression, such that when you make a chemical analysis of this shell, it would not be the original calcium carbonate, but would now be the crystallized silica crystals. So what a fossil needs to be formed is rapid burial in the right type of sediments. Rapid burial is needed because if the animal or the plant was left to decompose, then no impression on the sediments would be formed. And it would require the hardening of the burial sediment. There should be an exact timing between the composition of flesh and bones, deposition of water and minerals, and crystallization of minerals. I want you to realize, at the rate things are going in the present time, for example, an animal dies and then it decomposes, no fossil would be formed. But there are a lot of fossils on Earth, and the reason for that was that there was a certain time in history wherein it states that there was a flood which encased all dead plants and animals into mud, and this formed sediments. And I am talking about the flood in the book of Genesis in the Bible. So we see in here, for example, in North America, tree trunks that have been fossilized because they were buried before they could decompose. And eventually, the mud that buried them hardened and formed voids, which was filled by water with chemicals in it, which formed crystals. And this is now called petrified trees. Okay? Now, one argument of those who believe in Darwinian evolution said that the fossils, if you look at them, the more simple animals are found on the bottom, and then the more complex animals are found on top of these other fossils. But that is their interpretation of evolution. I want for you to think about a different scenario, and that is a biblical scenario. For example, the bottom-dwelling plants and animals in the seas would be found where? Simply on the bottom of the huge seas and lakes. Okay, and the fishes would be found swimming, especially those fishes that would have well-developed swim bladders. Okay, and then the amphibians would be found higher in their natural habitat, and then the land animals would be found high above the water level. And if that flood did occur in the book of Genesis, there would have been mud that would have formed, and the first to be buried were simply the starfishes and other bottom-dwelling animals and invertebrates that could only move very slowly. They were the first to be buried and eventually would be formed into fossils. The fishes could fight the mud and swim upwards, but eventually mud would cover most of the ancient lakes. But the animals that could crawl on land and go upwards would resist the rising flood of the book of Genesis. But eventually, as is said in the book of Genesis, even the tops of the mountains were buried. So even eventually the animals, the land animals were buried, but they were buried higher up than those animals which were naturally living on the lakes, especially on the bottom of the lakes. That is why when they find fossils, they will find that certain animals are on the bottom layer of the fossils, and those animals which were more agile were found on the upper layers. Okay. In here we can see a fossil graveyard, different types of animals, fossils of rhinoceros, horse, camel, and hippopotamus, and try to guess what continent they were found in. If Darwinian evolution was true, they would most likely be found in Africa, because that is where these animals normally live. But you know, this fossil graveyard was not found in Africa, but rather it is in North America. And that shows you there is something wrong with Darwinian evolution. For example, look at this mammoth. Elephants, where are they now found? In Africa and in Asia, isn't it? But the mammoth, or the ancient elephant-like animals, have a lot of fossils deposited in North America and Siberia, which today contains no living elephants or relatives thereof. Okay, so these mammoths were found in North America. And this is a fossil of a rhinoceros, which you might think was found in Africa, but was actually found in North America. This is a gigantic hippopotamus, again, not found in Africa, but whose fossil was unearthed in North America. So you might wonder, how come elephants, mammoths, rhinoceros, hippopotamus fossils in North America? How come? And in Wyoming, USA, they saw these fossils of camels, when in reality, no living camel is naturally found in the United States. This is the mystery of translocation of animals. Extinction of these animals in North America is unexplained by natural selection, which is a particular trait or idea of Darwinian evolution. Nevertheless, their existence in continents far away from North America could only be explained by the scriptures and not by Darwinian evolution, no matter how hard the scientists try. And what about continental drift? The Bible is also not silent about that. You can read that in Genesis 10:25. In here, we see fossil footprints of dinosaurs, which was unearthed while scientists were actually observing its unearthing. So there was no way that these fossil evidences were falsified or fake. This was found in the Paluxy riverbed, Glen Rose, Texas, okay, wherein the scientists were at hand, but eventually they found out that dinosaurs of different epochs and man supposed to have evolved 70 million years apart actually coexisted side by side. You can see it in here in some of the fossil footprints of dinosaurs and human beings, okay, existing side by side. If you look at the foot of this imprint compared to a modern man, you would find out that they are so huge. And Darwinian evolution again couldn't explain this. Why? How come ancient man had huge footprints? Actually, the Bible has an explanation. For in Genesis 6, it's stated, and in other parts of the Old Testament, it is stated that there were giants in those days. Okay? And if you study the Bible, some of the giants stated in there were in excess of 13 feet high. So another question would be, what happens when plants and animals are rapidly buried in the post-Diluvian world, that is after the flood? They simply decompose, and this could be seen on the issue of Mount Vesuvius in Italy, wherein a whole town or a whole city was buried by lava sediments. Okay? When these lava sediments rapidly buried the people and the animals on that city, okay, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, the plants and animals were buried, but they didn't form fossils actually. What they formed were voids within the sediments. These voids came about because the plants, the humans, and the animals, when they died, decomposed and turned into dust. So when they found out there were voids in the sediments, what the people did was they poured white cement, white plaster into these voids, and to their surprise, at the bottom you can find that one of the plasters, when they hardened, formed a perfectly well-shaped, preserved void, indicating a human being with a perfectly preserved impression on the sediments, but with no bones, no nothing, no fossil. So what you see in Pompeii, actually, near Mount Vesuvius, are the poured cement and white plaster poured by the scientists, in which they saw that the voids actually represent the decomposed voids formed by the bodies of the human beings and animals, men and animals, in the lava sediments. So the point we can see in here is that plants and animals today normally decompose and do not undergo fossilization for the most part. Very rarely, if ever, do plants, animals, and men form fossils in today's age, but that was not so in the so-called flood of the book of Genesis in the Bible, wherein a lot of fossils of plants, animals, and men were formed. Now, what about the dating method the scientists used? They used the lead age method, they used the rubidium strontium method, the potassium method, etc. So what I'm saying in here is that they get this, they test the sediments for the presence of these chemicals, and from there they would simply use linear decomposition of radioactive minerals into the decomposed state. Okay, but what they are doing is simply trying to get samples from the sedimentary plates. Notice that these dating methods actually could not date the plants and the animal fossils simply because the plant and animal fossils are not the original parts of the plants and the animals in the first place. Try to understand how a fossil is formed, which we have already discussed. And you will see that the fossils are not the original parts of the animals, but are simply crystals that form from the voids that were left as imprints by the plants and animals on the sediments. Only radiocarbon method could date the original remains of the plants and animals, but only if specimens were undecomposed. Notice that the fossil plants and animals have the original plants and animals decomposed a long time ago. That is why the crystals were formed. So the dinosaur bones that you see, the dinosaur eggs that you see, even the mammalian fossils that you see, that is the dinosaur bone fossils that you see, are not the original bones of the dinosaur. They are crystallized representations which formed when the original bones decomposed. Okay? So, at the most, I would say that the dating method being used by scientists are very misleading and actually false because they are simply guessing at the ages of the fossils, and they are not really able to date the fossils themselves, not unless the bones represented the actual specimens which were undecomposed. Okay, so these are the problems. The radioactive decay principle assumes daughter elements not present in the original state too big an assumption. So what I'm saying in here is not only is it erroneous because it tries to date the sediments, but there is an assumption that the Earth itself originally was extremely radioactive and it simply decayed over the years. That is why they formed this theory that the Earth are billions of years old, actually. But actually, simple logic will teach you this is false. Because radioactive elements are antagonistic to life. If the Earth was originally completely radioactive, and even to a large extent radioactive, no life would form in here. So you see, all the dating methods, all the assumptions of the scientists on these matters are very foolish, okay, and illogical. You see, God formed earth conducive to life. That is why He formed the earth in the original state in a non-radioactive state. Okay? All known dating methods do not date actual mineral fossils, only the sediments. And it is highly illogical to assume sediments of deposition and fossils are the same age. So the indexed fossil dating method again makes an assumption based on another assumption, which is again highly erroneous. So you see, don't be blinded by the PhDs, the doctorate degrees of these scientists. If you try and understand what they are doing, you would see actually the faults and the errors in the things that they are doing. So people are simply blinded. But a number of years, the scientists have studied their craft. But you see, if you know what they are doing, you would see the foolishness of what they are doing. And what about this problem about the Neanderthal man? Okay, this is an artist concept of a Neanderthal man. You notice he doesn't look anything close to a modern man. Actually, a Neanderthal man really is not only externally different, it is internally different. The skull of the Neanderthal man is different. Actually, you can see in this map the different location of where the Neanderthal man was found. Not only were they found in Eastern Europe, they were also found in the Middle East, even as far south as South Africa, and as far east as China. There were Neanderthal man fossils found in those areas. Overall, more than 100 Neanderthal man fossils were found scattered throughout the world, except on the continents of North and South America. If you look in here, on the middle is a typical Neanderthal man skull, which is quite different from a modern man or Homo sapien skull. This is the skull of a modern man, Homo sapien. Compare this to a Neanderthal man. Incidentally, fossilized remains of modern man or Homo sapiens, that is fossilized in terms of being crystals or petrified, are fewer in number than Neanderthal man. And what could this mean? This means that Neanderthal man was more widespread in ancient times than modern man. Okay? So in here we can compare the skulls of a modern man on the right and Neanderthal at the left, and you can see the extreme difference. Neanderthal teeth is almost double that of man. The nose actually is a lot bigger. Notice the hole on the skull for the nose, which is a lot bigger for Neanderthal man. Notice also there was a ridge on top of the eyes, which is not really that prominent in modern man. Okay, so if indeed the Darwinian evolution was true, at least in some parts of the world, since they were scattered all throughout the world, there would be a place where we would still find a living Neanderthal man. But you see, we cannot find any living representative of Neanderthal man. Comparing the cranial capacity of apes and man, we can see that modern man would have a brain size of about 1000 cc, while an orangutan would have something like 400 cc. Okay, and a gorilla would only have around 500 cc. Yet Neanderthal man, with about 100 specimens collected, had a brain size basically larger than modern man. In fact, one specimen they had even had almost a double the size of brain than modern man. Okay, so we see in here that Neanderthal man has relatively larger brain than modern man. Neanderthal man does not fall to the pattern of evolution as they are supposed to be older. Okay? If you were to follow those who believe in Darwinian evolution. Okay? But they were actually physically stronger with more developed bones and even larger brain than modern man, and fossilized remains, that is crystallized bones, or can we say petrified bones, shows us that they were more spread geographically, yet today they are extinct, and it could only be explained with the Bible, Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9, wherein it states that only 8 people were allowed to survive the flood, meaning our ancestor, or the ancestor of modern man, who was Noah. All men on earth today are Homo sapiens. We have the skull of modern man, the same skull, obviously, of the one who survived the flood. All those who were not able to ride the ark actually died in the flood, and that is the reason why Neanderthal man simply did not exist anymore. So we can see in here that the Genesis flood explains a lot of things in the fossil record. So in conclusion, we can say that fossils are proof of the accuracy of the scriptures. Dating method used by scientists are inexact and unreliable. In fact, very illogical. Existence and extinction of Neanderthals are consistent with scriptures. The translocation of animals consistent with the scriptures. Now I want to show you a simple logic. To show to you if Darwinian evolution is really possible. Let's get a pen and dismantle this pen and place it in a box. So we see the original pen on the bottom and the dismantled parts on the top. Okay, so we dismantle this pen. Now, after placing the dismantled parts of the pen in the box, try to randomly shake it twice, thrice, 100 times, 1,000,000 times, even 1,000,000,000,000 times. And I ask you, what are the chances that all parts will fall into the right place and be fastened? That is, the bottom part, that this middle part of the pen would enter the top and the bottom part, and then the different, the mechanisms of the pen, the mechanical parts of the pen would fall into the right place. Okay, I ask you, what is the probability by randomly shaking this that everything would fall into place? What would your answer be? Is that possible? Even if you shake it 1,000,000,000 times. Okay. What are the chances that all parts will fall into the right place and would fasten itself tightly? I believe that you will all agree with me that there is no possibility all parts would fall into the right place and be fastened. Yet this illustration is a lot more simple than the complex relationship we had showed in the beginning between the different organs of our body, the biological makeup of our body and their hormones, even the complex relationship between the different animals in creation. There's symbiotic relationships that they exist, to show to exist. Okay? So this dismantled pen is very, very simple compared to the anatomical features of man and animals. And yet we see that even scientists with their PhDs, doctorate degrees, believe in Darwinian evolution, and a lot of people are being misled that it is possible, even though it is the relationship and the anatomical features of plants and animals are much, much more complex than this simple illustration. So the existence of so many complex creatures and their perfectly formed anatomical structures could only be explained by creation in the scriptures. Brothers and sisters, I hope you can see, for creation to be formed with such perfect anatomical structures and symbiotic relationships, there has to be a very intelligent creator doing all these things. It cannot be attributed to chance, such as what Darwinian evolution would try to explain to us. So modern scientific education are misleading people with the theory of evolution. It is being forced, I should say, to those who are innocent, who are simply going to school, those high school students and college students. The theory of evolution is being forced onto them by their teachers. It is being forced to people to disbelieve creation and ignore. Okay? Modern scientific education are misleading people with the theory of evolution to disbelieve creation and ignore morality. Behind it all is the true author of the theory of evolution, the father of lies, the devil. Okay, thank you for listening. And this is One God Ministries. And listen to our other topics. Thank you.